Now, Britain, France and Germany are hosting a conference in London today, together with the African Union and the European Union, to mark the second anniversary of the start of the civil war in Sudan. The British Foreign Secretary has called on the international community to persuade the warring parties to protect civilians and allow aid in. The war is now entering its third year with a devastating toll. Charities say 30 million people desperately need humanitarian aid and tens of thousands have been killed. Officials say the aim of today's ministerial conference is to unite international partners around a common position to get more food and medicine into Sudan and to find a pathway to peace. Neither the Sudanese Armed Forces nor the Rapid Support Forces militia has been invited. The warring parties have been represented instead by regional allies, some of which diplomats say are fueling the conflict.
And today I'm announcing a further £120 million worth of support. But the biggest obstacle is not a lack of funding or texts at the United Nations. It's a lack of political will. With over 4 million refugees having fled the country and instability spreading far beyond Sudan's borders, it's also strategically wrong to forget Sudan. And that's why, as Foreign Secretary, I refused to turn away. I felt a duty to confront this war's horrors head-on. For their sake, we cannot resign ourselves to inevitable conflict. We cannot be back here 1 year from now having the same discussion. So today, let's show them and the world that we've not given up on them. We've not given up on Sudan.
There can be no military solution in Sudan. Only an immediate, unconditional cessation of hostilities. This, we believe, must be followed by an all-inclusive dialogue to end the war. It is also important to send a message clear and loud that the African Union will not allow a balkanization, a disintegration, or a partition of Sudan. We must preserve the sovereignty, the territorial integrity, and the political unity of the Republic of Sudan. We call on external actors to refrain from interference in Sudan. It does not help the good people of Sudan.
But the situation is worsening every day. We must therefore all mobilize. And that is why I have decided to allocate an additional €50 million to support the work of United Nations agencies and non-governmental organizations in Sudan and neighboring countries in 2025. My third conviction is that no lasting solution to the conflict will be found if civilian actors are excluded from the peace process. For the guns to fall silent, the voices of civil society must be heard.
France
has taken note of the roadmap presented by the authorities led by the Sudanese Armed Forces to restore a political transition. It reiterates the imperative of effective participation by all civilian actors within the framework of a single process. In this respect, I am particularly concerned by the intentions expressed by various actors to form governments unilaterally and outside of any process of conflict resolution. Let us be clear, the unity of Sudan must be preserved.
Germany is today pledging an additional €125 million for Sudan and their neighboring states. But we must ensure that humanitarian assistance can actually reach those in need most.
The Sudan crisis is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, and I'm committed to keeping it high on the global agenda. Let's make sure today's discussions lead to much needed relief for the people of Sudan. They are counting on us. We cannot look away. We all have a responsibility.
That's snippets coming from that conference on Sudan taking place in London today. Now let's turn to matters of Ukraine now, and Moscow has stoked the ire of Ukraine's Western allies following the most deadly attacks on civilians this year. It follows Sunday's ballistic missile strikes on the northeast city of Sumy. A number of foreign leaders called it a clear violation of international law, with Germany going as far as calling the strikes a war crime. Well, European Union foreign ministers met in Luxembourg yesterday to discuss how to jointly respond following those Russian deadly strikes on Sumy, in which more than 30 people were killed and over 100 injured. Well, let's speak now to the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, who monitored developments at that meeting, and he joins me now on the line from London. Dr. Laskiewicz, good to see you as always. So what did they come up with as a way to respond, beyond saying that they condemn the attack and calling it a war crime?
Well, President Putin has been accused of war crimes almost from year dot in this conflict, so I don't suppose that really amounts to much. And the outrage, well, again, it has to be borne in mind that if you make a comparison between what's happening in Israel and Gaza or in Sudan, then actually much of the outrage is simply, if you like, because the countries involved in this outrage, namely the European Union, don't like Russia. So therefore, their response to other such humanitarian crises are muted in comparison. This is not the key point, though. The key point is that Germany is considering sending long-range missiles to Ukraine so they can specifically bomb the Kerch Peninsula. The point about this is that they want to cut off Crimea. They want to make sure that Russia is attacked. And this, of course, once again underlines what I've been saying, that World War III is a nexus in terms of my theory, that it's very hard to avoid, because if the EU and Ukraine does nothing and Russia overruns Ukraine, that's a disaster. If, on your hand, they go too far, then sooner or later, if they prod the bear hard enough, he will respond. Please note, this sort of bombardment, conventional, involving the injuries and deaths of over 100 people, may sound bad, but it can get an awful lot worse, really bad, assuming that it ever goes up to phase 4, which is the nukes, tactical nukes, which I predicted would occur specifically in Poland, which is in fact what Russia has been stating. She has said that if the war escalates, it was Poland and the Baltic states that will suffer the most. Please note that Germany and France sometimes do go out of their way, and of course Poland has always gone out of its way, to ensure that they try and irritate Russia to the maximum, presumably, so that the war and the strikes can occur. The correct solution in all this was actually to aim for the ceasefire and to support Donald Trump in this, if it is at all possible. It is unlikely to succeed, but Europe could do an awful lot to help Donald Trump in this.
Well, I mean, this is one of your predictions that I certainly hope don't come true, because unfortunately quite a few of the other ones have come true. So that's why it's a bit worrying. But just returning to the immediate sort of term following this meeting in Luxembourg, I understand there was consideration of further sanctions, and there appeared to be agreement on a new package of 17 more penalties that includes the so-called shadow fleet. I wonder what you've heard about that.
Yes, it's quite true. They want to go for sanctions because sanctions are a reasonably pleasant way of attacking another country. Sanctions are a passive, in the sense you don't let things happen. Sanctions are purely economic, not political, let alone military. So they are indeed the preferred weapon of the West and have been for many years. There are two problems. Right from the word go, that is in February the 22nd, 2000, over 3 years ago now, 2022, I stated sanctions will be next to useless, that Ukraine needs military arms specifically to hold off Russia in a defensive way. And this is still the case. You see, Russia is a huge country. The sanctions, whilst they have some bite, and of course the shadow fleet is a particular aspect of this, are not going to bring Russia necessarily to the negotiating table. Moreover, the sanctions about the European market are, of course, directly at odds with what President Trump is doing. And to this extent, the European Union is being undermined by Donald Trump, because if he's saying there's going to be commercial possibilities with the USA, then the European sanctions will be quite pointless in that respect. So therefore, yes, it is something, not a lot. It will be yet one more, if you like, anti-Russian move by the EU to show that it supports Ukraine, which is yet one more reason why the war might escalate. But it is not a fundamental move.
And you mentioned President Trump there and his attempts to undermine the Europeans. I mean, I wonder what you make of Mr. Trump's comments yesterday, placing some of the blame at President Zelensky's feet for the people who've lost their lives in this war.
Yes. This is actually a very difficult issue, and it's, I think, only possible to discuss it on a rise, because what I'm about to say is certainly not wanted in other countries, and as a result, I'm not even permitted to speak on some television. The problem is, you see, that when President Zelensky came to power, there already were problems. The 2014 Crimea, there was the separatist movement, and he said he could solve this. What he actually did was simply say he refused to negotiate at all, and therefore the Russians, seeing that there were no further negotiations, did indeed invade. Well, invasions are, of course, illegal. To that extent, it is purely Russia's fault. But then again, you could argue Zelensky, had he played his cards better, and this is what I believe Donald Trump and his advisors have in mind, they could have avoided this. I explain. One of the reasons why Ukraine couldn't be in NATO is because there was a dispute about its frontiers. Had it settled the dispute of its frontiers, if necessary, by ceding some territory, there might have been no war at all. And the notion of ceding territory, by the way, is very difficult for every nation. In fact, I only know one nation which has done this quite successfully, and that is Poland. Poland, over the centuries, confronted by far superior forces, actually did quite well by ceding some territory here or ceding some territory there, and survived for centuries, ringed by enemies, to be honest. It is, of course, a very difficult concept. It requires negotiation. I'm not talking about ceding territory in the sense that Donald Trump means it. I mean in terms of compromise. I mean in terms of hard negotiations. That was still all possible at the start. So when Donald Trump puts it somewhat brusquely, and I think too forcefully, there is not entirely wrong in that had President Zelensky from the word go rethought what was possible and what could be done, then it might have all been different. Please remember, there are ideals in politics about peace and territorial integrity, and then there's reality. Realpolitik is what, for example, the Germans introduced during the Cold War, which is very, very a difficult step for them, about recognizing Eastern Germany, that is. And the point here is that, yes, Donald Trump has some rightness about him, but certainly not in quite the forceful way he's putting, giving the impression that President Zelensky is as culpable as President Putin. He is not. It is merely that had he done differently, the war quite possibly might have been avoided with all its attendant casualties and damage.
Well, briefly, because we're almost out of time, I mean, you mentioned the ceasefire earlier and all the sort of the things swirling around it. The talk around that ceasefire seems to have gone rather quiet. I mean, what sense do you get of what the EU might be doing to revive those talks and to engage with both Russia and the US? Or are they waiting, as some have suggested, for Russia to make the next move?
Yeah, interesting. First and foremost, the quiet is because Russia and America are now doing quiet negotiations and improvements in their relations. This is easily as important as the big summits and the big meetings, because what is happening actually is they are talking. That's the key point. Number two, the EU has decided, since it's no longer the equal partner of USA, it should just go its own way, which is a pity, because as I mentioned before, they could have supported the ceasefire, I think, Donald Trump, and in which case tried to bring about an ending of the war, which has some merits in it, of course. What is instead happening is the EU is, if you like, undermining the points of the ceasefire by means of three things. Apart from the sanctions we've mentioned and missiles, there's this third thing, which is the reassuring force they want to plant in eastern Ukraine. Well, this is precisely what the Russians don't want. And therefore, the Russians have this problem that if they were to agree to a ceasefire, then Europe would straight away send over its forces and therefore destabilize this situation yet again. So therefore, the EU is not helpful at this juncture.
Dr. Laskiewicz, thank you as always very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the International Affairs Analyst. He was talking to me on the line there from London.